Hello, I'm Anthony Wagg, and I want to give you early parts of a talk that I give on the history of sculpture from the ancient Egyptians to Henry Moore. It's a frightening subject, a frightening title, but please don't be intimidated. Oh, what have I got here? A button which I meant to put on, and a reel of thread. Oh well, how very appropriate. I wanted to talk to you today about the thread which linked the art of Egypt with that of Henry Moore. An intimidating title, but please don't be intimidated. It was the late and great Sir Ernst Gombrich who once said that there was a tradition that linked the art of today with that of the Nile Valley some 5,000 years ago. I want to explore that link. I want to see the thread that links these. It's a thread that you'll find that goes uphill and downhill and for a time disappears. But it does come back, and it is always there. And I want to examine the influences that move the sculptors over time. And I believe that there are three influences, major ones, and I can describe each with one word: money, power, religion. Money. It was John Ruskin who said that there was no example of any country producing good sculpture that was either torpid, weak, or in decadence. Power. I don't believe that we need go much beyond the pharaohs to see the influence of power. Did you know that Amenhotep III, who reigned in about 1345 BC, there are over 1,000 statues of him remaining today? And I suggest to you that the vast majority of these was commissioned by Amenhotep III himself. But whether it's a pharaoh, or a politician, an emperor, pope, duke, whatever, whether it was Pericles in Athens, Caesar Augustus in Rome, or the Pope in Rome, Medici in Florence, Francis I, or Louis XIV in France, they all had a major impact on the art of their country in their time. Religion. You don't need me to tell you the importance of religion in art. First of all, it must be the subject matter in more than 50% of all art. Secondly, the power of a church is so important. In the early days they forbade any sculpture, so there was none. In around 1550, at the Council of Trent, they mobilized, the Roman Catholic Church mobilized art and took it into battle to fight their cause. So money, power, religion. But why are all these so important? I believe it's necessary for us to understand what happens between artists. I know Leonardo, Michelangelo, Rodin, Moore, Bernini, but my knowledge is rather like those statues on Easter Island. Solid, upright, but with very little in between. I have no idea why Michelangelo sculpts like he does, and how he would have sculpted if he'd been born 100 years earlier or 100 years later. So let's begin. Kenneth Clark wrote in his book Civilization that there were three moments in time when everything moved just that little bit faster and further than you might otherwise expect. And the first of these moments was in 3000 BC, in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, and in the Nile Valley. In the Nile Valley there was money and relative peace, and art flourished. In 2550 BC, the pharaoh Chephren came to the throne. He was, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, mean and vicious. And unfortunately for the Egyptians, he had a relatively long reign. And he was the builder of a sphinx, the largest sculptor, man-made sculpture in the world. And that inscrutable face is meant, or believed by many, to be that of his father Cheops. Cheops, according to Herodotus, again, was cruel and vicious, clearly a family streak, and also long-lived. And it was Cheops who built the Great Pyramid of Giza, which you can see behind the Sphinx in the picture on the screen. He built this, according to many, to provide a gigantic staircase for his spirit to ascend when he died into the heavens. For what happened to his spirit and to him at his death was all important to a pharaoh. It was essential that not only his body be preserved, but that an effigy of his body should be there. It was essential to make it as long-lasting as possible. When we look at the statue of Chephren, it's made of granite. That's a good start for a long-lasting statue. And when we look at this statue, I put it to you that it's not there to show off his majesty or indeed his divinity, unlike the statues of Roman emperors which you will be looking at later. It is there to resemble him, to be a likeness, to enable him to live forever in the afterlife. And the rules for this statue were very simple and were enforced strongly. A rectangle of granite was taken, and the design was drawn on the front and the two sides. It was never expected to be looked at from the back. If he was sitting, his hands would be on his knees. If he was standing, his fists would be clenched. If he was standing, it would be 18 fists from the ground to his hairline. Men were to be darker than women. Here Chephren, head up, gazes straight ahead, looking into the far distance. And I would maintain that over the years this did not change. The statues of the pharaohs remained remarkably similar. But there are people, Gay Robbins, who's written many learned and readable books on the history of Egypt at that time, would disagree. She would tell you that expressions changed. She would tell you that shoulders rose and fell, that muscles increased and decreased, that statues moved from the tombs to the temples. And I couldn't disagree. But when I look at these three statues, with 1300 years or so in between them, I find it difficult to see many major differences. But you know something? I am wrong. I lie. For there was a moment, an amazing magical moment in 1353 BC, when suddenly everything changed like that. It changed when Akhenaten came to the throne. Akhenaten was a long-lost pharaoh and was rediscovered in the early 1800s by archaeologists who discovered the city Amarna, Akhenaten's city, which lies roughly halfway between Cairo and Luxor. And while you may not know a great deal about Akhenaten, I suspect that you may have heard of his lovely, beautiful wife, Nefertiti. Nefertiti currently lives in Berlin. She lives in the Neue Museum. And if ever you need an excuse to go to Berlin, use Nefertiti. She's wonderful to behold. Akhenaten came to the throne and he immediately abolished all gods but one, Aten, the sun god. He abolished all priests and he discarded all rules. And I believe that these are wonderful pictures. I think they're superb. But he died after 17 years. He was succeeded by his son, who was considerably better known than him, Tutankhamun. And within 25 years, Akhenaten had been wiped from the face of history. The gods had been re-established. The priests had been brought back, and the rules were there. Nothing had changed. And by the year 1000 BC, the power and the wealth of the pharaohs was declining, and so was their monumental statues. And you might well consider that you've been slightly shortchanged. We've done 2,000 years, and the thread has moved nowhere. But please be patient. Things are happening. In the Mediterranean, things are stirring. And in 650 BC comes Kenneth Clarke's second moment. In India, it is the time of Buddha, and in Greece, where city-states have gained power and wealth. And the greatest of these city-states is Attica, whose capital is Athens. And suddenly, out of the blue, arrive the Kori and the Kouros. And you can see that really they borrowed the technique from the Egyptians. The men had their left foot forward and their fists clenched. The women had their arms or arm across the breast. But there are two notable differences with the Greek sculptures as opposed to the Egyptians. Do you see them? Do you notice that with the Greek sculptures you have got gaps between the arms and the torso and the legs? And you also notice that these are the first statues in history that are freestanding. The Egyptians never had the courage to abandon the plinth at the back.